Teendyth, On Desecrated Faith and Newfound Religion, by StevenMark, Maine. These words that follow are an account of the author of this book, Absalom Teendyth IV, High Priest of the Great Perversion, Kaush. Praise be his name. Prologus. In the year 1786, a 30-year-old Dutchman changed his name to David Absalom Teendyth and moved to what was then known as New Amsterdam in order to help settle the east coast of the New World. In fact, everyone in his village had left, leaving David not much of a choice but to leave his position as pastor. It saddened him greatly, as his father was a pastor, as was his grandfather. They had all three taken care of and preached to the same Dutch church, and he would be the first to abandon it. With that, he uprooted his wife and traveled to America. Not long after he arrived, he was given the role of the local reverend, as he was the man with the most education in the field of theology, and the town felt as if they required a godly man to keep the demons that stalked the mountains at bay. David jumped at the chance to continue his family's traditions and spent his years in that settlement. He recounted in his old age, remembering when New Amsterdam became New York not only 2 years later. A few years after that, his wife gave birth to a son who they named David Absalom Teendyth II. David II would go on to become the next pastor of the church in what was known as Jericho. David I died after a long and full life, living to be over 100 years old. He died the same year that the portion of Jericho we lived in, now known as Bainbridge, split off into another town called Afton. His family lived in Afton for generations to come. David I witnessed the birth of his grandchildren and even his great-grandchildren. David II had 2 children, twin boys. The one who was older by a few minutes was David Absalom III, who would later take over as a reverend when his father retired. The younger was Eli, who would travel to seminary and further his enlightenment. Eventually, in his 13th year, David III would give birth to David Absalom IV. The words you are now reading at this moment are of David Absalom IV. At the day of my birth, 4 David Absalom Teendyths existed on this earth, and each one of them had been or were destined to be a pastor. More specifically, a pastor for the same church in Afton, New York. It was tradition at this point, and even though only 4 of us had served in America, the chain of ancestors who had served in some sort of leadership position more times than not as a pastor went back over 10 generations. At last, over hundreds of years, my father had reached his destiny, and when time came for him to fulfill that destiny, he fulfilled it with ease. He even looked as if he were specifically crafted for the role, as his countenance held a kind and pious nature, his body gently molded into a figure of grace. In his prime, he would even have been a fairly lithe man, but the long years and my mother's cooking had given him a thick but firm layer of pouching over his stomach. This chub did not stand out with the rest of his body, as his legs, which were as thick as cedars, were long and strong from years of walking to the houses of his parishioners. His arms were just as thick, but a lack of regular arm exercise caused the muscles to be affected by gravity and attached itself to the bottom of his biceps. His jaw was like a brick that had been taken over by moss, strong, but not as chiseled as it had been when first made. His light blonde hair was kept tight to his head. His facial hair was kept just as tight, providing a golden sheen to his pale face. His eyes were stern, yet were betrayed by glints of kindness that reared its head whenever he felt it needed. He looked the part of a pastor, spoke as a pastor, loved as a pastor, and above all, he acted as a pastor. His wife was in stark contrast to him in terms of height. Reaching over 5 feet tall when she stood on her tippy toes, she was a brute of a woman, forcing herself through any sort of pain that she suffered. Had she not been able to do that, she would have been more bedridden than she already had been. She dealt with chronic pain and weak lungs. She always struggled to keep weight and would try her best to make the most fattening and rich foods that she could on her meager budget in an attempt to keep herself from becoming too thin. Her dark hair was usually tied up to keep it out of her face, and she made it her duty to keep the house clean, but was willing to admit that all women may not want such things. Many of the wives of the deacons of the church looked down on her for such thoughts. She always paid them no mind. As their son, I looked as if I were my father's reflection, By the age of 7, I was already reaching the height of my mother, and would very quickly surpass that by the age of 9. Despite having the height of my father, I shared a fair amount of qualities with my mother, most notably my health. I was an asthmatic who lacked any sort of musculature, leaving me to be a fairly gaunt child. As I got older and my height increased, this only furthered the work my body required to produce any muscle tone or body fat in my body. I was borderline skeletal. But I pushed past my struggles much as my mother did. For a while, I was well enough to even carry on the tradition of spending the weekdays with my father studying in order to carry on the Teendyth family pastoral duties, which was no easy task. Those who have not been involved in the profession of pastoral duties would usually think that a pastor just means sitting around all day thinking about how you want to tell your congregation that they are doing something wrong. They do not realize that is a privilege reserved for only the worst pastors. In fact, those people are not pastors. They are preachers. The kind of man that tells you that he knows how hard you've had it your whole life, but has never had to give up his weekly steak, and he for sure was not one to give up the same steak for someone who was hungry. My father was not one of those preachers. He was a pastor, and a fine one at that. If anyone as far down the pecking order as the town drunk had the sniffles, he would be at their doorstep with a hot drink to soothe their throat. He used everything in his power to ensure people received what they needed to survive, and had a joy running through them. This eagerness to make sure all in his care had not only their needs, but all of their wants met, would eventually cause problems to arise within his own family. It was not only every elder Teendyth's duty to lead the church, but also to make sure that every younger Teendyth was prepared when he was handed control of the church. It was not uncommon to see each Teendyth traveling the streets of Afton hand in hand with his son. From the time that I was 4, I would sit with my father reading scripture until the late hours in the sanctuary. I would caravan through the streets while he modeled to me how to love and look after those who needed help. I saw the kindness in his eyes as he saw those who were struggling. I also saw the men going into the local bar immediately after my dad had given them money for food. He would pass by those same men later that day, asleep in the gutter. I did not know what they were doing, but I did know that my father gave them money for food, and that was not what they were using it for. One such example was from that of a man by the name of Charles Willith. He was an obese man that would, if given the chance, literally steal candy out of the mouth of a child. His entire family shared this trait, an obesity that was fueled by other people's food. They seemed to have a fetish for stealing food from others, a gluttony that was interlaced with envy. One year they asked my father to help them with a Christmas family tradition in which his child and his wife would make as many homemade sweets for the community as they could. That year was particularly povertous for my family as someone had been skimming funds from the tithe, meaning my father was not bringing in as much income as normal. My father gave them every single ingredient they asked for, and then some. Issues arose as my mother and I had the exact same tradition. Due to both our inabilities to gain weight, my mother and I made extra sure to cook as many sweets as we possibly could in order to gain weight for the winter months. We began the tradition when I was only 5 years old, my toddler mind creating the idea after learning about the hibernation cycles of bears. My mother agreed, and for the first time I had ever experienced my mother manage to gain some weight. The winter was much more bearable, as both my mother and I could stand walking past an open door without getting chilled. From that point on, we held the tradition every year. In fact, it was the 5th year that we had observed the tradition where the Williths had asked my father for those groceries in the first year since its creation that we were not able to see its fulfillment. The aforementioned tithe stealing made it impossible for my mother and I to replace the groceries that my father gifted to the Willith family. That winter seemed even colder than the previous, and my mother was bedridden for the entire season. The irritation of the subject was eviscerated by the fact that Benjamin, the Willith child, was known by all to be a childhood nemesis of sorts. To little Benji, as my parents called him, I was nothing more than an item to take his aggression out on. He was a loud-mouthed and spoiled, with a penchant for striking anyone who did not let him get his way. The only thing that I could figure out was that my existence somehow kept him from receiving what he wanted, as I was the usual target of these blows. The blows were not always physical, as he always had an ability to verbally abuse someone until they were an inch from mental death. This came at a price, though. as he could not keep something secret if he knew revealing it would cause someone harm. It was that inability to keep a secret that led me to learning that it was his father who was the one who was skimming from the church offering. No one had known that this was even occurring, and I had never made mention of the situation to that little bastard before. There was no reason to doubt his words. He also snidely confided that his parents did have more than enough funds to pay for ingredients for their tradition. They just felt an unholy need to watch my family suffer. I ran to tell my father as soon as I had been told. "Son, it is not my job to care that I was deceived. It is my job to make sacrifices to those who say they need. They will answer to God for their trickery." I never questioned my father's lackadaisical attitude to his family's persecution. Having to turn the other cheek was something that a person who was a member of a pastor's family had to do. It never occurred to me to hold deacons, which was the caste Willith was a member of, to the same form of persecuted decorum. "I understand, Father. I just wish that there was something that I could do. It seems that I am being bullied just for existing. I wish there was some sort of way any of us could do something to stop them from being mean to us." "Turning the other cheek is the only thing that we can do, son. The Bible says that those who follow Christ will be persecuted for their actions. I promise. It'll be easier with age. But until then, you will need to trust my guidance." I did trust his guidance. I always trusted his guidance. And it would be another decade before I knew what it meant to protect myself. That was not the only case of abuse that I suffered at the hands of not only Benjamin, but the other children that were around my age. I was easy prey for those evil machinations that only children can create. I was frail and easily broken, and my peers, all children of deacons, loved to watch things break. Their parents never saw fit to punish them, as they never believed that there was an issue in the first place. Most did not believe my pleas for help, as their children never acted so viciously around other children or their siblings. But I was not other children. I was their lesser. I could not chase after a ball without becoming winded, nor could I wrestle in the mud pits that formed in the fields without one of my bones breaking. It was unheard of that these precious children would do anything that was considered imperfect. They simply did not care. I was frail, and to them, frail could be cured by harassment. After all, Jesus simply looked at the lame man and proclaimed to get up and walk, and the man did. Why should their children's jeering be any different? All the name-callings and beatings, simply encouragement akin to Christ, never mind the hatred that shone through the eyes of my tormentors. Their perfect children just wanted me to overcome my sickness and were doing whatever they could to help my ailing body. At least those who simply saw their children as perfect did not encourage their behavior, but this caste of bullies was treated as if they were my saviors. Benjamin was neither of these. His parents knew about his poor behavior and did not attempt to portray it as anything but abuse. Instead, they joined him. The entirety of the Willith family were more pig than human and did not realize that most saw them as such. They always walked with their heads high, dressed in the best clothes they could afford. They saw themselves as the de facto governors of Afton, flaunting their wealth as if it actually belonged to them. If it was not made obvious by my previous anecdote, they procured their wealth through coercion and thievery. Their thievery was only unparalleled by their penchant for believing that they could punish the children of families for anything that they believed to be inappropriate behavior. Willith verbally stated at one time that my birth was inappropriate behavior, so to him my mere existence was a punishable offense. Whenever he experienced me standing up for myself against his brat, he would promptly shove his booted foot directly into my limbs. Most were afraid to call him out on this, and all of those who did noticed an increasingly large amount of items missing from their property. My father saw all of this and firmly held on to the sentiment that I should turn the other cheek, and I took pride in the fact that I was more Christ-like than those who abused me. But that sense of pride was not enough to keep my ribs from cracking under the heels of a grown man's foot. With my bones being cracked more and more as I aged, I began to shut myself in. My mind began to give way to the incessant bullying from Benjamin and his ilk, and my body took a turn for the worst with it. Thankfully, my father never forced me to join him on his walks or join him in his late-night readings at the church, as he respected the fact that I was ill. Despite that, He never truly faced the deeper issues that were the root of my newfound reclusive behavior. I never expected him to. I spent most of my teenage years in bed coughing and helping my mother around the house. A positive that came with my sickness and the need to stay home is that I developed a skill that not many bachelors at the time had learned, the art of taking care of one's living space. While I would not leave the house, it was important that I keep the interior clean for both my mother's and my own sake. Any sort of dust in the house would cause our weakened lungs to go into fits so severe that it would almost cause suffocation. And while my mother's condition worsened with age, mine began to improve as I worked around the house. The regular lifting and housework caused my body to finally take on some sort of mass. At first, I could only just manage to dust the house to ensure that we would not choke. Then I became strong enough to cook small meals for myself and then my mother when her ailments acted up. Over time, I had finally built enough muscle to chop wood to keep the house warm. By the age of 16, my body was finally in a state that fit my age, and while still weaker than most, I could very easily take regular trips outside of the house again. My lungs were still stricken with asthma, and I continued to keep to myself and spent my time caring for my mother. She could scuffle about a little, but still needed help around the house. I neglected my pastoral training and became my mother's assistant until the time would come for me to take over my father's position. The time that led to my consensual usurping of my father's position was wrought with long hours of not speaking to nor seeing my father. He had become increasingly submerged in his work in all ways, may it be spent in his office preparing for Sunday service or in meetings with the church members. While my mother and I saw him commonly in the mornings, his presence became more and more uncommon in the evening hours. He had taken to the habit of eating with the families of members and deacons in an attempt to further love them. It was unthinkable to some that he would willingly opt out of eating the food that my mother made, as Mrs. Teendyth's food was considered nothing short of sacred by all those who lived in the town. Even when he came home in time for supper, he would often be satisfied by the food that he had already eaten and refused to dine with us. My mother often said, "I know your father loves the food that I make, but I can't expect a man to only eat his wife's cooking and no one else's." I was never quite able to discern why she sounded so melancholy when she would relay that sentiment. Perhaps she simply delighted that much in her husband indulging in her cooking. Whatever the reason for her sullenness, she had always made it clear on those nights that she wished father would be with us. There were, of course, still times when my father would be present for dinner, and even more so times when he would be working in solitude at the church. On those nights, Mother would cook for all of us, then would have me deliver my father's dinner to him so that he could eat without ceasing his work. It was a short jaunt to the church, so the request was never too burdensome. My mother depended on me in her sorrow, and my father depended on me in his labor. These nightly treks, while less common than those times that my father failed to appear, became more common than the nights that he ate at our table. I traveled those same streets so many times I could traverse them with my eyes closed, even being able to avoid the drunks that laid about the streets. The back and forth became monotonous, not dissimilar to the trek one took to the restroom from their bed. That is, with the added inclusion of the aforementioned drunks. Thankfully, they were not an issue when I needed to use the restroom, though inviting them in to spend the night would not be unheard of course of action from my father. All but one of these nights could be considered forgettable, a drop of ink on a story preoccupied with other matters. The one night that broke the norm began in a similar manner. I dodged the inebriated and precariously balanced the hot jar of soup in my hands. Most of the layabouts had already gone off into unconsciousness, but one specifically stood out. Benjamin Willith had grown from a spoiled brat of a child that I had known into a spoiled brat of a man, with the addition of a crippling drinking problem. By now I was used to him being face down in the street water, but tonight he held himself as upright as possible. "Hey, Junior, are you bringing your daddy dinner because he refuses to come home to Mama?" Let it be known that it is not exactly as he said those words, as if I wrote them down exactly as he said them, that they would be unintelligible. I had experience speaking with drunks, so I knew their language. "I wouldn't want to be home with a pansy son either," Benjamin, We are adults. Playground insults are beneath us, I said as I went to press past him, but he blocked my way. My defiance against his harassment seemed to sober him up a bit, and his words were finally legible to those who were not well versed in alcohol. He slurred out words again. Dangerous thing to say to a future pastor. You know, I could turn your entire town against you. Get them to burn down your house. Hell, I could get them to burn their own houses down. The look of incredulousness on my face conveyed more than any words could, as Benjamin continued without my dialogue. Look, I have no reason to explain it to you. You're gonna go to the church anyway, so you might want to hurry before your dad signs away your birthright. I normally would have trusted any of the eerie noises that we all heard coming from the woods every night more than I would have trusted a drunk Benjamin, but the convictions in his voice was all that anyone needed to determine this man truly thought that he would be the next in line to lead the local church. Had I not known his father, I would have thought that these were just the words of a blathering drunk. If what he was alluding to was true, I needed to make haste to the church. I pushed past Benjamin, spilling soup on both him and myself, and sprinted toward the church. I heard the voices barking at my father before I could even enter the building. Well, David, if you truly want to retire, I find it only fitting that my son take the place of the local reverend. I could already tell the loudest in the room belonged to Charles Willith, Benjamin's father. It was not hard to pinpoint when it was him who was talking, as it was always loud and accompanied by the rattling of his thick jowls. Each sentence was punctuated with a wheeze, as his lungs were made for a man a sixth of his size. Stealing sugary goods tended to cause a man to balloon in size, especially when done as often as he did. Charles, your son is nowhere near able to take on the church. The timbre of my father's voice was shaky, holding back an anger that was rare for him to express. You and I are both aware that my son is the most prepared. Is he the most prepared, David? Your son has been disinterested in the church for quite some time now, and dare I say, disinterested in you. It has been years since you have done any sort of pastoral work together. Charles, my son has been sick. He just recently has been able to leave the house. And besides, you may think my Benji isn't prepared, but the fact of the matter is that we've been studying and working together for the last few years. I thought that it would be intelligent to prepare my son in the event that your son isn't ready to take on the position, as it seems his father hasn't prepared him adequately. It had taken what felt like a millennia to reach the doors to the sanctuary, despite it only being a short trek across the crimson carpet. Perhaps I had not realized that I had frozen in shock at the words I heard, but by the time I reached the inner chambers of the church, I could no longer stand the insults being hurled at both me and my father. I burst through the doors, ready to shout, "Would you louts cease harassing my father?" But barely a syllable was uttered before I was spoken over. As was typical with Willith, he felt the need to interrupt. I could not fault him for his rudeness, as the flap from his neck devoured his ears and muffled the voices of all who spoke. Ah, speaking of the young Teendyth, from the look on your face, I take it that you've been listening to our conversation. Tell your father that you have no interest in taking over the church. On the contrary, Deacon Willith, I actually have come to speak with my father about just that, I lied, trying to hide the jar of stew that I had brought for my father. Absalom, don't you know that lying is a sin? You don't need to defend your father. The fact of the matter is this. If your father wants to retire, there'll have to be a suitable candidate to take the pastor's place. A smug grin rippled through Willith's jowls. Besides, both I and the other deacons agree that your father has failed in preparing you for this duty. As I was saying earlier, before you rudely interrupted, Charles, my son has been sick. We are all well aware that he inherited a poor constitution from his mother. My father interrupted. It's a shame that your son has to suffer due to you engaging in poor breeding. The group of deacons chuffed at Willith's comment, but my father continued and ignored them. Even in my son's inability to study with me, I think most can agree that he is more prepared than Benjamin to run this church. Being a pastor does not involve drinking in excess, which seems to be the only skill that your son has developed so far. I had never seen my father so aggressive in his sarcastic defiance against those that he felt attacked by. For once, he had decided not to turn the other cheek and instead allow himself to be defensive. Whether he was protecting me or the pulpit, I was unsure, as both were being actively insulted. Besides that, you have attacked my ability to raise my son. Do you really expect me to force a sickly child to undertake a vigorous training? Don't fool yourself, David. We have all seen you traveling throughout the town, strolling as if you have no cares in the world. Even if he was ill at one point as a child, he has been in fine health ever since. You were just not manly enough as a father to force him to continue his studies. Your family no longer being in control of the church is recompense enough for being such a failure of a parent to your own spawn. At this point, I was rearing to brutalize Willith, whether it be with my hands or my words. I had sat back and held my tongue long enough. There was no feasible reason for me to allow my father to be destroyed by such an oaf of a man. You, the man with a drunken son, is telling my father about how much he has failed at raising me? Why not do every person in Afron a favor and swallow a hot coal? I yelled. Absalom! My father barked. How dare you stoop to such a level as this man? Perhaps I was not forceful enough in your upbringing, as you seem more than well enough to open your mouth to spew hatred. He was right, of course, and his scolding took any moxie that I had and ripped it out of my spirit. He had finished berating me and found it his turn to berate himself. Apparently, I have not been strict enough in my teachings, for if I had been, you may not have been so quick to open your mouth. Willith tried to scoff at my father's admittance of guilt and began to speak of Benjamin being made pastor again as if he was a bird repeating the only words he knew. So we are all in agreement then. Benji will become the next pastor of Athens Assembly once Teendyth the senior retires. My father rubbed his eyes and spoke in a tight voice. Charles, I never agreed that I would allow your son to take my place as pastor. I simply admitted that you were correct in saying I neglected my son's education. Yes, he was sickly, and yes, he stayed at home instead of joining me even when he was in good health. That does not mean that he was loafing about as he was helping his ailing mother take care of the house. A few of the deacons chuckled to themselves, amused that their future pastor was doing anything outside of the parameters of their perceived notions about a man helping with a woman's work. My father continued. Even then, it is no excuse. I should have taken a better care to raise him in a manner that would befit his future status, so this conversation would have never had to happen. My father's face relaxed as he continued to speak in a more subdued manner. But it's too late for that now, and the answer is simple. I won't retire. A synchronized gasp left the mouth of all those in the room, including mine. My 20th birthday was coming at the end of the month, and it was unheard of for any Teendyth man to break tradition. You cannot pastor this church forever. Willith seemed as if he was now grasping at straws, trying to find a way to my father to step down and give his precious Benji control. Whether it was for some petty squabble or some deeper conspiracy, I had no idea. All I knew is that my father would not be allowed to have me continue in his footsteps as pastor when he retired. I began to sink into my self-pity, thinking of how I had forced my father to deny his want for rest and fulfillment of tradition. I had fully realized my lack of preparation and had only hoped that no one else had noticed it either. My heart sank as the realization that not only the church elders but my father seemed to be in agreement. My father spoke again. I know, Charles, that this is exactly why I will be sending my son to seminary. There is no possible circumstance that I would allow Benjamin to lord over this church, as we all know that he has become the worst of all the drunks in town. He spends his days traveling between the bar and the whorehouses. Whether he travels by feet or belly is up to fate itself. I also recognize that in no way will you allow my son to take my place, despite him being adequately prepared. So I will do as you wish. I will stay as pastor. My son will go to study. If he returns and you still refuse his leadership, it'll be known by all of the people of Afton that you are corrupt." The countenance of all present had already dropped, and with that they were completely shattered. It was clear that all of them, for some reason or another, had become reliant on Benjamin Willith becoming the next pastor. One smug face remained, though. Hidden under a layer of fat was the curling upper lip of the apparent ringleader. "Tell me then, David, how will you afford to send Junior here to college? All your years using your income to provide for the town. You sure don't have enough to fund it yourself. I would offer to help you myself, but I simply don't have anything to spare." "I have it arranged already. His schooling has been taken care of." "Surely you jest. University is expensive, and there's no way they would give your son free tuition for no reason." I looked over at my father and saw his calm demeanor get replaced with the same smug look that was splayed across Willith's. It was a fitting look for him. "Do you remember my brother Eli?" Willith's face turned red in anger. Uncle Eli, over the years of ceaseless study in the fields of academia, had become a professor of theology at the same seminary he had attended. He had become somewhat of a local celebrity. It had been unheard of for someone from our little town to uproot and make a name for themselves, but Eli Teendyth had become very well known for his upward mobility. "We all do, David. What about him?" Willith was speaking through gritted teeth. If he could be said to have disliked my father, it was just as easily said that he despised my uncle. What Willith craved was power, and the only way that he could exert his authority over others was in his position as a deacon. The thought of anyone with more power than him was repulsive, and made his flabby face curl into the worst of grimaces. My father continued his speech. "You see, Charles, I had a feeling that if I tried to step down when my son came of age, that you might raise an objection." For once, my father did as I always wished he would. He bit back at the one trying to trample him. "And while I feel that my son is more than ready, I will say to your worries. I have spoken to my brother about the situation at hand, and he is understanding of the circumstances. He has put in a good word for my son to attend his college. He will be attending next month, and while he is away, I will delay my retirement. I would rather break a small tradition in order to make sure that my son can take my place. It is not right for a non-Teendyth man to pastor this church." The last comment was added for the extra twist of the dagger that my father sunk into Willith. No one had expected this response. Not the deacons, not Willith, and definitely not myself. Willith looked as if he was going to strike my father, but somehow held himself back. While he showed no positive attributes classically held by the elders of the church, he at least was able to keep himself from resorting to violence. While this was pretty low standards for a deacon, it was still surprising to see where he would draw the line. It may have also been that he was too much of a coward to strike a grown man, despite being so willing to strike me as a child. "David, I strongly advise you to give control over the church to my son, for I will fight any other outcome." Willith all but growled out the words through his teeth. My father parried the thinly veiled threat. "Charles, it seems that you care less about my son being ill-prepared and more about your son as given the position of power." He paused to catch his breath. "Seeing as we are at a bit of an impasse, why don't we put the fate of the church up for vote?" The gathered men shifted and murmured as they waited for Willith's response. Willith looked around at the other deacons as he answered. "All right. All in favor of my son Benjamin being the next pastor of Afton Assembly, raise your arm." Every single deacon present gave each other knowing glances while they raised their hands in unison. My father's voice was flat as he spoke. "I will not be conspired against, Charles. We will ask the people of Afton what they believe should take place. What does it matter to have a church that people will not attend? There would be no worship, no teaching, and as some of you are concerned, no tithe." At this, a spike of murderous intent leapt into Willis's eyes. "We will hold a vote with the people of Afton, and they will decide who will be in charge of the church." Willith tried his best to save face as he ranted against the words of my father. "There really is no reason for that, David. We did not call this meeting to ask your opinion on the matter. We have more than enough power over the church to make the decision whether you agree with it or not. The people will still very willingly come to church no matter who the pastor is. The residents of this place care nothing about religion or worship. All they want is to feel safe from the superstition in hell. To them, coming to church is not about the relationship you prattle on about. To them, church is nothing but praying for a service." By now, my father had settled back into his docile mannerisms again. "Even so, Charles, people do not care for a decision being made for them. You may be right that these people do not care for any of this religion, but even if they don't, they will not appreciate being tricked." Willith's confident air dropped at this, knowing that if they did instate Benjamin against the wills of the townspeople, the church pews would never be full again. Even if Benjamin was John the Baptist incarnate, the people would reject him if he was forced upon them. While the previous pastors had all been determined by their birthright, no vote was ever needed, as everyone agreed that the position belonged to Teendyth. Most did not refer to the congregation as Afton Assembly, instead calling it Teendyth's church. It was the way things were, and there would be an uproar if that had ever changed. Willith sputtered one last attempt to gain control. "But even if they do vote for your son, he is required to attend college. He is in no way suited for his job in his current state." "I wouldn't have it any other way," my father agreed. They shook their hands in view of all attending to sign the pact that would speed me into the next chapter of my life.